You think because you're rich, you can treat people like garbage? The words cut through the first-class cabin like a blade. Every passenger froze. The billionaire CEO's face went white. But this wasn't just any flight attendant speaking. What happened next would expose a secret that would change everything. About power, about dignity, and about who really holds the cards when the masks finally come off. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't who you think. The Gulfstream's engines hummed with the promise of luxury. But the first-class cabin had become a war zone. Marcus Sterling, whose net worth could buy small countries, clutched his 18-month-old son like a briefcase he couldn't figure out how to open, the child's piercing wails echoing off Italian leather seats that cost more than most people's cars. "Sir, perhaps I could help," Sarah Washington began, her voice warm honey over steel, but Marcus cut her off with the precision of a corporate executioner. "Don't you dare touch my son," he snarled, his Armani suit wrinkled from the struggle, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cabin's perfect climate control. "I didn't pay $50,000 for this flight to have some." He paused, his eyes scanning Sarah's rich brown skin, her perfectly pressed uniform, her name tag that read Senior Flight Attendant, and then delivered his verdict with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences. "Some affirmative action hire telling me how to handle my own child." The words hung in the recycled air like toxic gas. Sarah's hand, which had been reaching toward the distressed toddler, froze mid-gesture, but her expression remained serene as a lake before a storm. Around them, the other first-class passengers, tech moguls, oil executives, a senator's wife, suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating, their phones urgent, their window views absolutely riveting. The child's screams intensified, tiny fists pounding against his father's chest, but Marcus seemed more concerned with establishing dominance than addressing his son's obvious distress. "Do you know who I am?" he continued, his voice rising above his child's cries. "I own 3 hotels in this city. I have the airline CEO on speed dial. One phone call from me, and you'll be serving coffee at a truck stop in Nebraska." Sarah straightened slowly, her 5'6" frame somehow seeming to fill the entire cabin space, her dark eyes holding depths that Marcus Sterling, despite all his billions, all his power, all his connections, couldn't begin to fathom. The baby continued to scream, passengers continued to pretend they couldn't hear, and Marcus continued his tirade, completely unaware that he had just picked a fight with the wrong person on the wrong day. Because sometimes, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who shouts the loudest or waves their money the highest. Sometimes, it's the one who stands perfectly still and listens, storing every word, every gesture, every casual cruelty for the moment when the universe demands its reckoning. Friends, before we go further, may I ask a small favor? Please subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us keep bringing you these stories, and reaching 1,000 subscribers soon is so important for us to continue. We also love hearing from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how our little storytelling circle is spreading across the world. And if you enjoyed the beginning, give this video a like and let's share thoughts on the whole story together below. Sarah Washington absorbed Marcus Sterling's venom like marble absorbs rain, completely, silently, without a single crack in her composure. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes not from training but from something deeper, something earned through battles he couldn't imagine. She turned gracefully to the passenger in 2A, switching effortlessly to flawless French as she explained the wine selection to a Parisian businessman who had been struggling with the English menu. "Le Chateau Margaux, 2010 serait parfait avec votre dîner, Monsieur Dubois," she said, her accent so perfect that the man's eyes widened in delighted surprise. To the nervous first-time flyer in 3B, she offered reassurance in gentle Spanish. explaining turbulence patterns with the kind of technical precision that suggested she understood meteorology as well as hospitality. Las corrientes de air son completamente normales a esta altitud, señora Martínez. Su pequeña va a estar bien. Marcus watched this linguistic ballet with growing irritation, his son still wailing in his arms, but other passengers began to take notice of something extraordinary happening in their midst. When the senator's wife mentioned her migraine, Sarah didn't just offer aspirin. She suggested specific pressure points and breathing techniques, speaking with the authority of someone who understood the neurological pathways involved. The temporal artery compression often responds better to cooling therapy than medication alone, Mrs. Richardson. If you'd like, I have some specialized techniques that might help. She demonstrated a precise pressure point massage that immediately began to ease the woman's pain, her hands moving with surgical precision. To the tech mogul worried about his presentation in Tokyo, she offered insights into Japanese business etiquette that went far beyond standard cultural training, mentioning specific regional preferences and recent economic policies that even surprised him. The Kansai business culture differs significantly from Tokyo's approach, Mr. Chen. Given your semiconductor focus and the recent trade negotiations, you might want to emphasize partnership sustainability rather than pure innovation metrics. Her knowledge seemed bottomless, effortless, as if she carried entire universities in her mind. All the while, Marcus Sterling's child continued to scream, and she kept glancing toward the baby with an expression that mixed professional concern with something deeper, a maternal instinct that seemed to understand exactly what the child needed, even as its father remained obliviously fixated on his wounded pride. She moved through the cabin like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony, addressing each passenger's needs with the kind of personalized attention that money typically couldn't buy, her every gesture demonstrating a grace that came from somewhere far beyond service training, hinting at depths that made Marcus Sterling's billions seem suddenly remarkably small. Marcus Sterling's fury metastasized like a cancer through the first-class cabin as he watched Sarah command respect he believed belonged exclusively to him. "This is unacceptable!" he bellowed, shifting his screaming son from one arm to the other like a burden he couldn't wait to dispose of. "I want her fired! Now! Get me your supervisor, get me the captain, get me someone with actual authority." His voice carried the entitled rage of a man who had never been denied anything, whose tantrums had toppled governments and restructured economies. He fumbled for his phone with his free hand, nearly dropping his child in the process. The toddler's cries becoming more desperate as tiny hands reached helplessly towards Sarah's retreating figure. "I'm calling Richard Blackstone. Yes, the airline CEO. He owes me 3 favors from the Denver acquisition." Marcus snarled into his device, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Richard, it's Marcus. I need someone fired immediately. Some flight attendant thinks she can embarrass me in front of—" "What? You're in surgery? I don't care if it's your mother's surgery." He ended the call with theatrical disgust, immediately dialing another number. "Senator Crawford? Marcus Sterling. Remember that campaign contribution? Good. I need you to call your contacts at the FAA." His son's diaper had clearly been soiled for some time, the smell beginning to permeate the cabin, but Marcus seemed oblivious to everything except his wounded ego. When the child reached desperately for Sarah as she passed, Marcus jerked him away roughly. "Stop that! She's nobody! You don't reach for the help," the baby's cries intensified. His little face red and streaked with tears, but Marcus continued his power display, name-dropping like a man drowning in his own importance. "I own Sterling Industries. We employ 40,000 people. I have dinner with governors. I play golf with Supreme Court justices." He gestured wildly with his phone, nearly striking his son's head in the process. "This woman, this nobody, thinks she can treat me like some common passenger. I've spent more on this flight than she makes in a year." The other passengers watched this display with growing discomfort, some recording discreetly on their phones, others whispering among themselves about the spectacle unfolding before them. Marcus's child had moved beyond crying into the kind of exhausted, hiccuping sobs that break hearts. His tiny fingers clutching at his father's shirt while receiving nothing but irritation in return. "Maybe you should tend to your son," suggested the senator's wife gently. But Marcus whirled on her with vicious precision. "Don't tell me how to raise my child. You people think money doesn't matter, that success doesn't matter. But watch how fast your opinions change when I make one phone call." His empire of connections had become his weapon, his billions, his ammunition. But he was about to learn that some battles cannot be won with money, and some opponents cannot be purchased, threatened, or destroyed, only underestimated. The first-class cabin transformed into a moral battlefield where souls were weighed against self-interest, and the scales tilted precariously with each passing moment. Tech mogul David Chen, whose semiconductor empire depended on government contracts that Marcus Sterling's political connections could influence, cleared his throat and spoke with calculated diplomacy. "Mr. Sterling, you're absolutely right to expect premium service. Perhaps the crew needs additional training in recognizing distinguished passengers." His words dripped with the kind of corporate cowardice that builds fortunes while destroying consciences. And Marcus's eyes gleamed with vindication. Oil executive Patricia Vance, who had been quietly negotiating a pipeline deal through Sterling's Midwest properties, nodded enthusiastically. "Honestly, the service standards have declined terribly. When I flew this route last month, the staff was completely unprofessional." She shot Sarah a look of manufactured disdain, her moral compass spinning wildly under the magnetic pull of $100 million contract. But across the aisle, a different current was building. Dr. Elizabeth Richardson, the senator's wife, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her migraine forgotten as she watched Marcus jerk his sobbing child away from reaching towards Sarah. "That poor baby," she whispered to her husband, but Senator Richardson placed a warning hand on her arm. Marcus Sterling had contributed 7 figures to his last campaign, and another election was coming. The Parisian businessman, Monsieur Dubois, who had been charmed by Sarah's perfect French, found himself torn between gratitude and pragmatism. His company needed American investors, and Sterling Industries was legendary for their international partnerships. He stared at his hands, speaking to no one. "Sometimes we must. How do you say? Pick our battles carefully." The nervous Spanish woman, Senora Martinez, clutched her daughter closer, remembering how Sarah had calmed her fears in her native tongue. But when she caught sight of Marcus's cold stare, she looked away, whispering silent prayers for forgiveness. Young Wall Street trader Jake Morrison, whose hedge fund was courting Sterling's investment portfolio, actually laughed at one of Marcus's cruel jokes. "You're killing me, Mr. Sterling. These people really don't understand hierarchy, do they?" But his laughter sounded hollow even to his own ears, and his girlfriend Emily tugged his sleeve, horrified by his performance. "Jake, stop," she hissed. But he was already too deep in the sycophantic hole he'd dug. The cabin's atmosphere grew thick with moral tension, decent people wrestling with their better angels while calculating the cost of courage. Some passengers began recording discreetly, their phones hidden but capturing everything, while others deleted videos they'd already taken, suddenly concerned about their own exposure. In this pressurized tube hurtling through the sky, humanity's eternal struggle between right and expedient played out in real time, with Sarah Washington standing at the center like a lightning rod, drawing both the admiration of the righteous and the resentment of the compromised, completely unaware that she was about to demonstrate what happens when someone refuses to bend, refuses to break, and refuses to let injustice pass unchallenged in any space she occupies. The toddler's cries had evolved from mere distress into something far more alarming, the kind of desperate, weakening wails that pierce through trained indifference and activate every parental instinct within a 50-foot radius. Sarah Washington, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, felt her professional composure crack as she noticed the subtle signs that others missed. The child's flushed cheeks weren't just from crying, they carried the telltale flush of fever. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. His tiny hands, which had been reaching desperately moments before, now hung limply at his sides with the kind of lethargy that sends mothers racing to emergency rooms. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carrying a new urgency that cut through his continued rant about connections and consequences, "I think your son might need medical attention." But Marcus was too deep in his performance of power to register anything beyond his wounded pride. "Don't change the subject," he snapped, bouncing the child roughly in an attempt to quiet him, completely missing the way the toddler's head lolled backward. The concerning pallor beneath his feverish cheeks, the fact that his cries were becoming weaker rather than stronger, Sarah's maternal instincts, honed through years she would never speak of in this context, screamed warnings that overrode every protocol, every professional boundary, every self-preservation instinct that had kept her safe in hostile environments before. She stepped closer, her trained eye cataloguing symptoms with clinical precision. The child's fontanelle appeared slightly swollen, his pupils were dilated, and most alarmingly, when Marcus shifted him, she glimpsed what looked like a faint rash spreading across his neck. The kind of presentation that could indicate anything from a severe allergic reaction to something much more dangerous. "Sir, please, look at his breathing pattern." She tried again, her voice taking on the kind of authority that had once commanded surgical teams and research laboratories. But Marcus was performing for his audience now, his child reduced to a prop in his theatre of dominance. The other passengers began to notice too. "Doctor," Richardson leaned forward with growing concern, her medical training from decades past stirring to life. Senora Martinez clutched her own daughter tighter, recognizing universal signs of a child in distress. Even the sycophantic hedge fund trader felt his stomach turn as he realized they might be witnessing something truly dangerous. The cabin's air seemed to thicken with tension that had nothing to do with altitude, as Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice. Respect the boundaries that kept her job safe and her identity hidden, or risk everything to help a child whose father was too consumed with his own ego to recognize that his son might be facing a medical emergency that could escalate from uncomfortable to catastrophic in a matter of minutes, 35,000 feet above the ground, where every second of delay could mean the difference between intervention and tragedy. The moment arrived, like lightning splitting an endless sky, sudden, inevitable, and absolutely devastating in its precision. Sarah Washington had endured the racism, absorbed the threats, weathered the cruelty with the grace of someone who had survived storms that would have shattered lesser souls. But watching Marcus Sterling ignore his child's obvious medical distress, while performing his theatre of dominance, finally shattered the last restraint, holding back her thunder. "You think because you're rich, you can treat people like garbage?" The words erupted from her with the force of accumulated dignity, each syllable carrying the weight of every injustice she had witnessed, every slight she had endured. Every moment she had chosen grace over vengeance, until this instant, when grace became complicity and silence became betrayal of everything she stood for. The first-class cabin fell into the kind of absolute silence that precedes earthquakes. Every conversation dying mid-syllable, every champagne glass frozen halfway to lips, every heart skipping beats as the reverberations of her challenge settled into the recycled air like fallout from a moral atomic bomb. Marcus Sterling's face transformed through a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation that spoke of a man who had crushed opposition before and would do so again. His son continued his weakening cries in his arms, but Marcus seemed to see only the insubordination, only the threat to his carefully constructed hierarchy of power and submission. "Did you just he began, his voice dropping to the whisper that his boardroom enemies knew preceded their destruction. "Did a flight attendant just speak to me like that?" His eyes narrowed into predatory slits as he shifted his son carelessly to one arm, pulling out his phone with the other, like a weapon being drawn for execution. "You have no idea what you've just done. No idea who you're talking to. I'm going to have you arrested the moment we land." Harassment, threatening a passenger, probably theft too, because people like you always have something to hide. His voice gained momentum like an avalanche, fed by decades of unchallenged authority and the absolute certainty that money could solve any problem, destroy any enemy, silence any voice that dared rise against his empire. The other passengers watched this confrontation with the horrified fascination of witnessing a car crash in slow motion, some pulling out phones to record what felt like a historical moment, others shrinking deeper into their seats as if proximity to such naked conflict might somehow contaminate them. But Sarah Washington stood perfectly still in the center of it all, her 5'6" frame somehow commanding the entire cabin space, her dark eyes holding depths that Marcus Sterling, despite all his billions, all his connections, all his practiced cruelty, couldn't begin to comprehend, because he was about to learn that some people cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, and cannot be destroyed by anything he possessed in his arsenal of wealth and influence. Without waiting for Marcus Sterling's permission or acknowledgement of his threats, Sarah Washington moved with the fluid precision of someone who had navigated far more dangerous waters than corporate intimidation, her hands reaching for the distressed child with the kind of confidence that bypassed all protocol and spoke directly to emergency. "Your son has a fever of approximately 102 degrees. His fontanelle is showing signs of increased intracranial pressure, and that rash on his neck suggests a possible allergic reaction to the new formula you switched him to 3 days ago, the hypoallergenic one your nanny Maria recommended because the original was causing digestive issues." Her words fell like precision strikes, each medical observation delivered with surgical accuracy, while her hands performed a rapid but gentle assessment of the toddler's condition, checking his pulse points, examining his pupils, feeling the temperature of his skin with the kind of systematic thoroughness that spoke of years in pediatric care. Marcus's mouth fell open, his threats dying on his lips as he processed not just her medical expertise but the impossible specificity of her knowledge about his private life. "How do you—" he began. But Sarah was already reaching into her service kit, producing not the standard first aid supplies but what appeared to be a compact medical assessment device, checking the child's oxygen saturation with equipment that definitely didn't come standard with flight attendant training. "The acquisition of Henderson Medical last month was brilliant timing, by the way," she continued conversationally while applying a cooling compress to the child's forehead with practiced ease, especially given the Pediatric Research Division's breakthrough in treating exactly this kind of formula sensitivity. "Though I'm surprised you didn't consult with your own company's specialists before making the Prust dietary change." The cabin had gone from silent to stunned as passengers realized they were witnessing something impossible. A flight attendant, who apparently knew more about Marcus Sterling's business empire than most of his board members, while simultaneously demonstrating medical skills that belonged in a children's hospital rather than 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. "Your son's symptoms are manageable but need immediate attention," she said, her voice taking on the kind of authority that made even Marcus step back instinctively. "And while we're discussing medical care, you might want to call Dr. Patricia Chen at Stanford Children's. She's the one who consulted on your wife Rachel's postpartum depression protocol last year, though I know that's not something you typically discuss in your quarterly investor calls." Marcus Sterling, billionaire CEO, master of the universe, found himself speechless for perhaps the first time in his adult life, staring at this woman who seemed to know things about his family, his business, his private struggles that should have been impossible for anyone outside his inner circle to possess, while she continued to care for his son with the kind of expertise that suggested she was far, far more than anyone in this cabin had imagined. The child's fever broke under Sarah's expert ministrations, his breathing steadying into peaceful sleep against her shoulder. But the real earthquake was just beginning as she looked up at Marcus Sterling with eyes that held the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from watching carefully laid plans reach their perfect conclusion. "Allow me to properly introduce myself," she said, her voice carrying the weight of revelation that would reshape everything Marcus thought he understood about power, about hierarchy, about the very ground he stood on. Dr. Sarah Washington, pediatric psychologist, best-selling author of Corporate Sociopathy, Leadership in the Modern Age, and, she paused, letting the moment crystallize like diamond under pressure, the anonymous majority shareholder of Sterling Industries, the one your board refers to as the silent partner in your quarterly meetings. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror as the implications crashed over him in waves. "For the past 18 months, I've been conducting ethnographic research on corporate leadership behavior in uncontrolled environments," she continued, gently rocking his son while delivering the academic death blow, traveling incognito to observe how executives treat service workers when they believe there are no consequences, no witnesses who matter, no accountability for their actions. Her PhD in developmental psychology from Harvard, her medical degree from Johns Hopkins, her 3 best-selling books on childhood trauma and corporate culture, all of it had been carefully hidden behind the uniform of someone Marcus had dismissed as beneath his notice. "Your company's stock performance has been interesting under my stewardship," she said with clinical detachment, "but I've been far more fascinated by the behavioral patterns I've documented, the correlation between wealth accumulation and empathy deficit, the way power corrupts decision-making processes, particularly regarding the most vulnerable members of society." Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, desperately scrolling through contacts, trying to verify what couldn't possibly be true. But Sarah anticipated his next move with the kind of strategic thinking that had built her fortune. "Richard Blackstone owes his position as CEO to my recommendation after the previous leadership's unfortunate scandal involving employee mistreatment. I do so hate when my investments reflect poorly on my values." The other passengers sat transfixed, realizing they had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a masterclass in how true power operates, quietly, methodically, and with devastating effectiveness when finally revealed. "Your son is going to be fine," she added, her voice softening as she looked down at the sleeping child. "But I'm afraid the same cannot be said for your current position unless we have a very different conversation about leadership, accountability, and what it truly means to hold power over other human beings." The revelation detonated through the first-class cabin like a controlled demolition, each piece of Marcus Sterling's carefully constructed reality crumbling in perfect sequence as Sarah Washington stood cradling his son, her true identity reshaping every power dynamic in the pressurized tube hurtling through the stratosphere. Every interaction, every casual cruelty, every display of what you consider leadership has been meticulously documented for my research, she explained with the calm precision of a scientist presenting findings, along with corroborating testimony from your employees, your business partners, and now, she gestured toward the cabin filled with passengers who suddenly looked at Marcus with new eyes, your fellow travelers who have witnessed your character firsthand. The transformation was immediate and devastating. Tech mogul David Chen, who had been eagerly currying favor moments before, now cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Washington, I actually wanted to discuss some concerns about Sterling Industries' contract practices. They've been systematically underpaying our smaller vendors, and when we tried to address it." His voice gained strength as he realized he was no longer speaking to a powerless flight attendant, but to the woman who could make or break Marcus's empire. Oil executive Patricia Vance, her face flushed with embarrassment at her earlier sycophancy, leaned forward urgently. The pipeline deal, Marcus, your people threatened environmental activists, tried to suppress our safety reports, and when that didn't work, they attempted to buy off local officials. The confessions began flowing like water through a broken dam, passengers who had witnessed Marcus's behavior now emboldened to share their own experiences with his corporate practices. Senator Richardson's wife spoke up about the Veterans Hospital Marcus had promised to fund but never delivered on, while the Parisian businessman detailed how Sterling Industries had abandoned a development project in Lyon, leaving hundreds of workers unemployed without severance. Your employment practices alone, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the growing chorus of accusations, violate approximately 17 federal regulations that I've documented, not to mention the psychological damage inflicted on employees who've testified about your company's toxic culture in my research interviews. Marcus stood frozen, watching his reputation disintegrate in real time, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls he suddenly didn't want to answer. As news of his behavior began spreading through social media, passengers had been recording everything, and the footage was already going viral under hashtags that would trend globally within hours. The hedge fund trader who had laughed at Marcus's jokes now looked sick, realizing he had aligned himself with corporate toxicity that could destroy his own career, while his girlfriend openly recorded her own statement about witnessing workplace harassment. The board meeting next Tuesday should be particularly interesting, Sarah added with academic detachment, considering they'll be voting on new leadership standards that I've been advocating for months, armed with extensive behavioral data that demonstrates exactly why change is necessary. Marcus Sterling stood in the wreckage of his empire, his sleeping son peaceful in Sarah's arms, while his world collapsed with the inexorable precision of natural law finally asserting itself over artificial hierarchy. You have a choice, Doctor, Sarah Washington said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. And it's the same choice every human being faces when confronted with the consequences of their character: evolve or become extinct. The cabin had transformed into a courtroom where justice wore the uniform of service, where power revealed its true face, not through intimidation but through competence, compassion, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing one's worth isn't measured in dollars, but in dignity. Marcus's hands shook as he scrolled through his phone, watching his stock price plummet in real time as videos of his behavior spread across every platform, his carefully cultivated image dissolving under the harsh light of truth that no amount of money could dim. I built this company, he whispered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. But Sarah's response cut through his delusion with surgical precision. You inherited wealth and mistook it for wisdom, accumulated power and confused it with purpose, surrounded yourself with yes men and called it leadership. But leadership isn't about making people smaller so you can feel bigger. It's about lifting others up until they can stand on their own. The other passengers watched this moral reckoning with the fascination of witnessing history being written, understanding that they had seen something profound. The moment when artificial authority meets authentic power, when money collides with merit, when character finally trumps capital. Dr. Washington handed the sleeping child back to his father, with the gentleness of someone who understood that children aren't responsible for their parents' failures, her eyes holding compassion even for the man who had tried to destroy her dignity. Your son deserves a father who leads by example, who builds rather than tears down, who understands that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Marcus Sterling, billionaire CEO, master of the universe, found himself face to face with a truth that his money couldn't buy, his connections couldn't influence, his power couldn't control. That in the end, we are all measured not by what we accumulate, but by how we treat others when we think no one important is watching. Because someone is always watching, someone is always taking notes, and eventually, inevitably, character reveals itself in ways that no amount of wealth can hide or power can suppress. The plane began its descent toward a new reality where Marcus Sterling would have to choose between the man he had been and the man he could become. While Sarah Washington returned to her duties, her research complete, her point proven that true power isn't taken. It's earned, one act of grace at a time.